الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين صلى الله وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم أجمعين. We begin in the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the compassionate, the merciful. We ask that He send peace and blessings upon our noble and our beloved Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wasallam. We begin by asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He teaches of our religion that which benefit us, and He push away from us any knowledge that does not benefit us. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He have us benefit from the words of our noble and our beloved Prophet alayhi salatu wassalam, in a way that changes our condition inwardly and outwardly through His gentleness, His generosity, His mercy, and His ease. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that these words that we learn from the Prophet alayhi salatu wassalam, that they be a proof for us and not a proof against us, that we be people who become Muhammadan inwardly and outwardly through the words of this noble and this beloved Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sahbihi wasallam, and that we grow in love through them, and that we grow in knowledge of Him, and we grow in application. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, wa sallallahu wa sallam ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi sallam ajma'in. All right, alhamdulillah. So this is day 2, inshallah, of this text summarizing or compiling 59 hadith of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa ala alihi wa sahbihi sallam. And you should have a text. Actually, I don't think we put it up yet on the, I'll do that, inshallah. I'll put up the text for those who are online. I forget, Allah reward you all, those who are online. We have a text of the ahadith. I'll share those with you. And then I did intend to put up the commentary as well. And the hadith text is just like a rough translation. I wrote out the words in Arabic. And then most of the translation is a translation of Amjad Tarsin. Maybe some changes here and there. And then the commentary is almost wholly a translation of Amjad. And then I'll put up the syllabus as well for Al-Mukhtar min al-Hadith al-Sharif, a selection of the noble hadith of the Prophet alayhi salatu wassalam. And we talked about the fact that it was an abridgment. It was a summary of another hadith text, Shifa al-Saqim, by Imam al-Habib Muhammad al-Haddar, of about 360 odd hadith, which was an abridgment of Imam al-Suyuti's al-Jami' al-Saghir. And we covered some of the words and the definitions of hadith science, and we covered the first hadith. And today I'll give you a few more important terms, and we'll inshallah get through hadiths 2 and 3. And then we'll try to stay at 2 or 3 hadith every day so that we finish 30 in the first semester. And then if we come back to it next year, inshallah, we'll finish the other 29 bi-idhnillahi ta'ala. And I won't test you today. Maybe inshallah after I put up, I'll test you, come back to it. So we said hadith is of 2 types. There are 2 main disciplines in hadith science. And each of them has multitudes of sciences under it, but there are 2 main distinctions. One is called al-riwaya, and the other one is called diraya. And what we're doing in this class is riwaya. And we define that for you. And this definition, by the way, is from Sheikh Abdullah Sirajuddin, one of the last great hadith scholars of Syria. He wrote the book Our Master Muhammad, Sayyidina Muhammad Rasulullah, and he's an enormous hadith scholar just died in 2002, not that long ago. And he wrote, he defined it as, or what he transmitted as its definition, is the science or the discipline that includes the following: sayings of the Prophet ﷺ, his actions, his attributes and characteristics, his tacit approvals, and also the narration of these transmissions, the explanation of the words and their meanings, and the precision in regarding to the narration. And then Misbah asked me what I was going to cover today, which is what is ilm al-hadith bid-diraya? Okay, you told us what riwayah is, what's diraya? And that's the discipline through which we know the reality of the transmission, and its conditions, and its types, and its ruling, and the state of the transmitters and their conditions. Sure. It is the reality of the transmission, or the essence of the transmission, and its conditions, and its types, and its ruling, and the state of its transmitters, and their conditions. And really, generally, the different types of transmitted texts and what is related to them. So this is a non-technical definition so that it makes sense in your head as you're writing this down. So when it comes to riwayah, it's dealing a lot more with the actual content of the hadith, and it's dealing a lot more with you're learning what the Prophet ﷺ said and he did. With diraya, again, this is very non-technical, you're dealing a lot more with the science of the transmission, right? And each of those is going to have multiple different sub-disciplines, right? Great. All right. Another 3 terms that I want you just to learn today before we go into the first hadith. One is al-hadith an-nabawi. Al-hadith an-nabawi. You know the word hadith. You know the word nabi, prophet. Nabawi is saying it belongs to the prophet. So hadith of the prophet. So they do define this word. And you'll see why later. We can't use one class to talk a lot about this, but as we go on. This is a hadith that has been ascribed to the prophet in terms of sayings or actions or characteristics and attributes or tacit approvals. And one of the reasons, or one of the wisdoms they say, or one of the how it was named, there's more than one. One is this is what he said, but also they say that it is hadith. That means it is not pre-eternal, right? For those of you who are on the Aqidah class, remember the word for eternal, and then there's a word for temporal or contingent. So the Prophet's speech is not pre-eternal. It's not eternal. It was created, right? Whereas the speech of Allah is not created, right? So that's another reason why, or one of the reasons they say why it was called hadith as opposed to called something else. One point here that's important to keep in mind is that some of the scholars, and definitely the laity, they use the word hadith to mean more than just what the Prophet said, did, his attributes. They include the sayings of the companions. They include their actions and the sayings of the predecessors and the tabi'een, those who follow the companions. So again, defining terminology is really important because somebody might use the word hadith and mean only things that are about the Prophet ﷺ. Another person might use the word hadith and mean what's beyond that, right? So you don't need to fight somebody if they tell you they're using it differently than you, but you should be aware as you're engaging, you're reading what they're using that terminology for, right? All right, another term that I want you to know, and then one more and that's it, is sanad, as-sanad. And they define this, they're going to use another word that we're going to have to define, and the 2 terms are in each other's definitions, which makes it a little circular, but stick with me. It is the path that leads you to the metin. It is the path that leads you to the metin. And we'll define metin in a moment. In other words, it is the narrators, the path of the narrators of that hadith. And Sheikh Abdullah says they named it that because they connect the chain to its origins. Right? So the sanad is, Taysir, heard from Sajid, heard from Brad, heard from Nuh, heard from Patrick, that Bilal said X. What Bilal said, we're going to see, is the metin. Right? But the sanad, or the isnad, is that chain. Right? Okay. So the metin is defined as, and you'll see it's difficult to grasp unless you have some type of bigger picture, what the chain ends at. So the chain ends at the speech. إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ. That's the metin, right? That whole hadith. But the chain with which we got it from, that is the sanad. So any questions about this before we get to the hadith for today? These are terms. Why am I teaching these terms? Because even though they're not necessarily in the text, if you don't know them, it's very hard to talk about the hadith because you're going to refer to certain words. If you don't know those words, then it's hard to even have a conversation. Anybody have any questions? Okay, great. No questions. We'll keep moving. So hadith number 2, you can open your text here, inshallah, and follow along. So we're at hadith 2. قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم أبغض الرجال إلى الله الألد الخصم رواه البخاري ومسلم. The Messenger of Allah, Allah bless him and give him peace, said, the most abhorrent of men in God's sight is an obstinate quarreler. And this is narrated by both Al-Bukhari and Muslim. It's narrated by both Bukhari and Muslim. We'll talk a little bit about them after this hadith. So what is abghad or bughd, abhorrent? So the commentator says that it means to be distant from. And of course we know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not in time and place, so they don't mean physically distant from Allah. They mean Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you're distant from His pleasure and His sight. In other words, they're denied His mercy and His grace. And what's an alad khasim? What's an obstinate quarreler? A person who stubbornly argues for argument's sake. Right? And whether we're looking at ourselves or we've experienced other folk that are like this, we know that it exists. And sometimes we're better than other times. Sometimes we'll just argue for argument's sake. So what are some lessons that we can learn from this hadith? A person who argues wrongly to win arguments and doesn't concede even after truth has been made clear to them and doesn't respect any opinion except their own is extremely distant from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has ordered us to follow the truth. That's why the Prophet ﷺ says in another hadith that wisdom is how does it translate? I'm forgetting the English word for it. It's the lost Bismillah, Allahumma salli wa sallim alayhi wa ala alihi. It's basically like the lost object of the believer, right? So wherever he finds it, he takes it, right? So if you find somebody who's teaching wisdom or saying truth, you take it regardless of who's the person who's saying it, right? So the person who's an obstinate quarreler, they're not taking it even when it's true and even when it's from people of truth, because they're too stuck to their own opinion. So there's a lot to learn from this that I want to expand on a little bit before we move to something about Bukhari and Muslim and then the second hadith. One is that it's natural for us as human beings, if we're not reared and refined a certain way, to like our own opinions. And just because you're a person of faith does not mean that that's removed. In fact, religion, if misused, can be an extreme form of an ego boost, right? Because what you're saying is that God is giving you truth and now you're manifesting the truth, right? So it's almost like it's aiding you in making argument, right? And it aids you in thinking that you're right. That's why if it's not taught properly, it can have a negative impact, right? Just because somebody hears religion doesn't mean that they're going to be humble, right? And it's interesting how humanity always averts themselves and goes away from the texts that tell them to work on themselves and focuses on texts that tell them to focus on the actions of others, right? Or they themselves just focus on the actions of others, right? And the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ is that you clarify, you don't argue, right? Even about things that you know are true. So you might think that this is about people who are in the wrong, but it's not just about people. It's about people who are in the right, So, for example, we talked about this a lot in the Aqidah class, right? Okay, you learn the Aqidah of Ahl Sunnah. Now you got to go tell everyone that their Aqidah is wrong. No, you shouldn't do that. And even if people want to argue with you, you shouldn't argue with them. The way of the Prophet ﷺ is clarification. It's not argumentation. It's clarification. It's not argumentation. And anyway, taking a person's ego head on is never the right way. Right? If you're going to do that, and sometimes the scholars will do that, but that will be rare, and it will be just, it isn't for the person as much as it is to show that the religion has a certain level of nobility to it. Right? But it's rare. Right? If you really want to affect a person, how is arguing with them going to impact them positively? Right? You're better off just praying for them. And we won't get a lot into it. And inshallah, Shaykh Abdul Karim will teach about kind of the diseases of the heart and these types of things. But everyone's ego, which is a faculty of their soul, has a part of them that is, sometimes they translate as aggressiveness or anger, ghadab. And one of the attributes of that is that it's going to like to quarrel and to be right. Right? And so it's a natural element inside of you that you have to refine. And not all of us will have the same problem with it. Right? Just like some of us have positive traits naturally. Right? And some of us has to work on those positive traits. And others have other positive traits naturally. And we have to work on other positive traits. Some of us will have negative traits naturally. And then we'll have to work on getting rid of them. Some of us won't have a problem with those. So people who are argumentative and they just find that natural, they have to work on that. And some of us are not naturally argumentative, but only sometimes are going to be argumentative. So we have to be able to rear ourselves back and refine and pull ourselves back. Right? And anybody who's argumentative, you know that that's not part of the religion. Right? As they say, there's a sunnah to teaching the sunnah, right? And it's definitely not shouting at people, arguing, telling people they're wrong, engaging in long debates. It's just not the way that the religion is supposed to function. Right? If people don't want to hear the truth, they don't want to hear the truth. You clarify and then you leave it to Allah. You leave it to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Imam al-Shafi'i, is narrated to have said that he would pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put the truth on the tongue of his opponent in any type of conversation or any type of debate. Imam Malik is narrated to have said that debate for the scholars is disliked and for the laity it's forbidden. And always by the words of the Prophet ﷺ, they're so vast, there's so much meaning, right? So one of the things that we learn from this hadith as well is that the opposite of it is beloved to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? If what's disliked by Allah, what displeases Him is quarreling, right? Then not quarreling is beloved to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And being a person who brings people together, not a person who causes conflict.
Only like in a religious context of when you're discussing with somebody, or is this like in every aspect of living? Like if Brad and I had a discrepancy about where parking should be because of our objective opinion, subjective opinions,
right?
Or in the workplace, which occurs very often in certain professions, that people have disagreements. And it's the nature of some professions that people will get in debates and heated discussions.
Sure. So I'm going to repeat just in case for the people online. So Sajid asked a good question, which is it only in regards to the religion, or is it in regards what's beyond that? And then he also mentioned that certain, for example, careers or certain parts of your life, it's natural that there are going to be disagreements. So what's important here to note is that we're not saying that you're not supposed to clarify a position, or if you're engaged in a conversation, you can't say your opinion. Debate is different than that, and pushing really hard is different than that. And if it's a really heated moment that, for example, you're a physician in somebody's life, that's not what they're talking about. They're talking about wanting to push your position regardless, right, and of no benefit in the situation, right? So I'm going to maybe clarify a little bit more. So in a da'wah, let's leave even out other contexts, and we'll come back to other contexts. In da'wah, some people might say, oh, let's do the event this way. Some people say, let's do the event this way. And they're people from the same background, studying the same area, but their natural inclinations are different, their understandings of the situation are different. They're going to give different opinions. So one thing like our teachers say is in da'wah is they say you should go with the group. And once the group decides, just go. You should, khalas. You don't need to like say, oh, they didn't go with my position. I'm not going to go to the event. Or I'm going to go to the event, but I'm going to be upset the entire time. Right? Because that's a clear indication of your own ego. That's not, as long as the group said that way, go. Even if in the next life that you were right. You did what you're supposed to do, now you go with the jama'ah. Right? So I don't know your specific career situation, like how it would play out. But, you're definitely supposed to clarify what you think. You voice your opinion if it's relevant. Right? And but you got to be careful about your ego and how that's playing in. And really, a lot of this will be known better if you learn the disciplines that surround the heart and the inclinations of the heart, right? I think beyond that, cursing, being stern, these types of things, all of that you should know regardless. But, when it comes to kind of the nuances of why you're saying it, I think that's really, really important. That's why they'll say things like, if you want to speak, you shouldn't. And if you don't want to speak, then you should. Right? And that's maybe really nuanced, but it's a good question, right? And I definitely don't mean it. I don't believe that the Prophet ﷺ meant that you don't clarify what you think is right. And if it's your job, you're not supposed to say, oh, we heard in Hadith class that we're not supposed to quarrel and debate, so when my boss asks me something or I ask a group, I'm just not going to give my opinion. Right? No, that's not the intent. It's a good question. The other thing that I wanted to mention, and see if there's any other questions about the Hadith before we move on, is in this, you see the exact opposite of what extremist manifestations of the religion are. In all of their shades. It doesn't matter. Right, left, up, down. Right? All of its manifestations. Extremism, holding to your opinion's right, everyone else is a disbeliever. Right? And it starts small. Right? It starts with like argumentativeness. Then it's like that person's misguided. Then it's that person's a heretic. Then it's that person's a disbeliever. Then it's that person, we don't have to fulfill his rights. Then it's that person, we can kill them. Right? And it expands like that. But no, we didn't see this in the way of the Prophet ﷺ. In fact, when the Sahaba disagreed during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, many times he said they're both right. And a really clear example of this is during the Battle of the Trench. After the Ahzab left, the Prophet ﷺ went home and he was going to take off his battle gear, and the archangel came to him and he said, don't take it off. You have to head straight to the Jewish encampment, because they had sided with Quraysh and they had been working as traitors from behind the scenes. So he told everyone, head towards their gates, and the phrasing of the Arabic could have been understood, don't pray Asr until you get there, meaning that even if Asr comes in and goes, don't pray unless you get there, or that try to get there quickly before Asr gets out. So they started going, and Asr, they're about to miss out on Asr, and some of them said, what do we do? And a group said, well, he just meant go quickly. We're going to stop and pray. The other said, no. He meant get there and then pray. So they took two different opinions. And when they told the Prophet, he said, you're both right. Right? No one said, you know what, you're wrong. How could you say that? You don't understand the religion. Nobody did that. Right? And so that's not the religion of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. And our intellects are supposed to be using those things, and there's differences of opinion, and the differences of opinion in his community are a mercy. Right? That doesn't mean that there is no right answers. That's not what we mean. Right? But there's an etiquette of dealing with the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, and there's an etiquette of how the scholars deal with one another. Imam al-Shafi'i, it's well known that when he went to pray at the grave of Imam Abu Hanifa, that he prayed not as a Shafi'i, that he prayed as a Hanafi, right? Because he doesn't, what's the point, right? It's not my school, that's it. No, that's not the way that it's supposed to be, Right? Any questions about this before we move on to a little bit about Imam Bukhari, Imam Muslim, and then the next hadith? Yes, Auntie?
When I first became a Muslim, Abdul Karim told me, people are going to tell you a lot of things. Just don't listen.
Allah reward you.
Because I read some bad advice.
You know, I'm really happy that you told me that, because I've told that to a bunch of new Muslims, and I always feared that maybe I was being too harsh. But if Shaykh Abdul Karim did it, then...
No, because I was fortunate enough to be with a family that had knowledge.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people who were in my situation who would probably have believed those things, you know?
There's a friend of ours, Abdullah Dan. He just finished his PhD at Princeton. He's teaching at UIC. He went to college with us. He said something that really, it made me sad. It was a great metaphor, but it makes me really sad. He said people treat converts like a white canvas.
Yes, exactly.
Like a whiteboard that they can write what they want on. It's really sad. Any other questions or comments? Okay, so this hadith is narrated ultimately by Bukhari and Muslim. They're the ones who compiled it in their texts, right? So who are these two figures? We can learn a little bit about them. So the name of Imam al-Bukhari is Abu Abdullah Muhammad ibn Ismail ibn Ibrahim. You don't have to write all of it, but at least get his name. His name is Muhammad. Abu Abdullah Muhammad ibn Ismail ibn Ibrahim ibn al-Mughira ibn Bardizbah al-Bukhari. Right? His name is not Bukhari. That's his nickname. He's born in 194 after the Hijrah and died in 256 after the Hijrah. So remember I told you last week that there were these levels of how hadith kind of formulated as a discipline. So at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, people would memorize what he would say, right? And it was inspiration from Allah, but they wouldn't write it at first. Then the Prophet ﷺ allowed them to write it, right? Then came a period in which people were keeping their own kind of collections of it, right? And then there was a period when people wrote down not just the sayings of the Prophet ﷺ, but they wrote down the sayings of the Tabi'een, and they wrote down the sayings of the Sahaba. And then there came a period when they said, oh no, we're going to collect books only with the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. Then came this period in which they started to separate out what they viewed as authentic versus what they viewed as good versus what they viewed as weak, etc. And this really begins with al-Bukhari, right? As far as we know, he's the first Muslim scholar to have done that, right? So remember, there's 194. So if the Prophet ﷺ died in the year 10, right, it's 180 years later. And what we're not saying is that nobody wrote down Sahih Hadith before Bukhari, that it was like 180 years later. That's a misunderstanding, okay? He's born in Bukhara, which is currently in central Uzbekistan. That's why he's called al-Bukhari. His father died while he was young, memorized the Quran, and began the study of Hadith at the age of 10. He visited great centers of learning, like different parts of Iraq, including Baghdad, Mecca, different parts of Asham, different parts of Egypt. And his most famous work, when they say it's narrated by Bukhari, generally they mean it's narrated by him in his book, Al-Jami' al-Sahih, which they now call Sahih Bukhari. He narrates a dream that he had in which basically he is moving away flies from the Prophet ﷺ. And he interprets the dream as being that he's differentiating what the Prophet ﷺ said from what he didn't say. And he said this is one of the impetuses that caused him to compile this text. And he compiled it over more than a decade. And it's said that he looked at over 600,000 transmissions when he was collecting it. And we'll talk about that in a minute. That book actually only has 7,275 transmissions. Right? So of those 600,000, he only put in it 7,275. And he said about himself, I have made this book a proof between me and God. And it said about him that he wouldn't write a hadith until he prayed 2 rak'ahs of istikhara after purifying himself. One other story that I can share with you that I really like this story, that's why I always tell it. It said that Imam al-Bukhari, when he came to Baghdad, he had already gained like a little bit of a reputation. So for us now, we're like, oh, al-Bukhari, right? Because amazing, this amazing scholar. But in his time, people didn't know who he was, right? He had just started to gain reputation, and he came to Baghdad. So a lot of the hadith scholars were talking about this new scholar, up-and-coming scholar, Imam al-Bukhari, and that he had like an amazing memory, and he's really learned. So they set up kind of like a greeting party, but they had basically wanted to test him. So what they did is when they sat him down, they brought out 10 students, each with 10 different hadith, right? And they had each of them come and narrate to Imam al-Bukhari 10 hadith. But what they did was they moved around the chains and the matan of the hadith on purpose. So then each one went and they narrated it. And after they finished, they said, you know, Imam al-Bukhari, we wanted to know your reflection about these students and their hadith. He said, I don't know any of those hadith. They said, how do you not know any of those hadith? He said, you stand up. He said, you narrated the following. And he said the 10 hadith exactly as how the student had narrated it. He said, I don't know that, but I know these. And then he narrated them properly. And he went through all 100 hadith. And they say in the biography of him, they said after that all of Baghdad cowered before al-Bukhari. Right? So, here it mentions the numbers of hadith. And there are different, like you'll find in the books of hadith that there are different numbers of what's the total corpus. But some of the teachers that I've studied with, they say that it's probably around 60,000 that are not without repetition, right? Probably around 60,000 without repetition. But there are many, many, many more. There are hundreds of thousands. And that 60,000 is not, you're not going to find like agreement that it's 60,000. So when they say al-Bukhari, that's who they're talking about. All right. How about Imam Muslim? His name is Al-Husayn. Abu al-Husayn. Muslim ibn al-Hajjaj ibn Muslim al-Qushayri al-Naysaburi. Born in 206 after the Hijrah. Died in 261. In Nishapur. He studied in places like Hijaz, Nishapur, Kufa, present-day Iran, present-day Egypt. He also studied with greats, like who? Ahmad ibn Hanbal. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala be well pleased with him. And Imam al-Bukhari, who he studied with for 6 years. And his text is called Al-Musnad al-Sahih. Again, they call it Sahih Muslim. And he said about his own text, I compiled it from 300,000 different hadith. And in it are 7,748. Yeah, Noah, you had a question?
Yeah. You said he studied with al-Bukhari?
Yeah.
He died 20 years, though, before?
So Bukhari died in 256.
56.
And Muslim died in 261. But Bukhari was born in 194, and Muslim was born in 206. No worries. And they're really the two first authors to put together these texts. And generally there's consensus that they're the two most authentic texts in our religion. Obviously the Mus'haf doesn't count because it's the most authentic. It's from Allah. Okay, so that's a little bit about them, and knowing a little bit about these individuals is really important. It's not the only text they wrote. They wrote quite a bit, And there's actually a relatively good book if you're looking for something in English. It's really long. It's written by Dr. Jonathan Brown, and it's his doctoral thesis. And it's called On the Canonization of Bukhari and Muslim. Dr. Brown's a Muslim. I know him relatively well. He studied with a lot of the scholars in Egypt, Sheikh Hussam al-Azhari and others. He might not be like a muhaddith, but he's a historian of hadith. Converted at Georgetown. All right. Any questions before we move on to the last hadith for today? We're right on time. It's great. Alhamdulillah. Any questions? Okay, great. Let's do hadith number 3, inshallah. قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم اتق الله حيثما كنت وأتبع السيئة الحسنة تمحها وخالق الناس بخلق حسن حديث حسن رواه الترمذي. The Messenger of Allah, Allah bless him and give him peace, said, keep God in mind wherever you may be. Follow a sin with a virtuous act, thus erasing it, and be beautiful in your character with people. A sound hadith narrated by a Tirmidhi. So some important definitions. Taqwa, ittaqillah. It's a command. Ittaqi, right? Have fear of Allah or be mindful of Him. So this has a lot of, the word taqwa is like notorious for its many definitions. So yes, it means being in a state of fear. It means awe. It means awareness of God. And generally they translate it as fulfilling His commands and avoiding His, or excuse me, they define it as fulfilling His commands and avoiding His prohibitions.
In the law.
Yeah. And here the Prophet ﷺ says, wherever you may be. Because it's a lot easier to have taqwa of Allah in public. It's harder to have taqwa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in private, and even more difficult to have it inside of your heart. And I've told you this before, but I thought it was beautifully put. Sheikh Nuh told us a story of his teachers asking one of the knowers of Allah, what is the end of this affair? And he said, witness with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to be with Allah, right? In other words, to be always aware of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and to be always with Him in all of your conditions. And then the Prophet ﷺ said, follow a sin with a virtuous act. So you follow a sin with, after repenting, with prayer, with charity, dhikr, asking Allah for forgiveness and istighfar. And then he says, then it'll erase it from the records of the books of the angels. So this is important. It doesn't just outbalance it, it erases it. Right? So it'd be one thing that it would just be written in the good deeds, and then, okay, now you're kind of like, you're hedging your bets sort of thing, right? You got more in one book. No. It'll erase, the bad deed will be erased because of your good deed. And the verse of Quran, which we've shared before, the two verses, إِذْ يَتَلَقَّى الْمُتَلَقِّيَانِ عَنِ الْيَمِينِ وَعَنِ الشِّمَالِ قَعِيدٌ مَا يَلْفِظُ مِنْ قَوْلٍ إِلَّا لَدَيْهِ رَقِيبٌ عَتِيدٌ. And those of you who were in our class last semester, the name of each of the angels is Raqib and Atid. They're ever watching, right? And so, and we had mentioned to you in the last class that the one on the right who writes the good deeds is in charge of the one on the left. He doesn't like the one on the left, right? Until he makes sure that you're not going to ask for repentance, you're not going to do a good deed. And Ghazali is amazing. He says about this, like about having taqwa, he says he says that you should be careful not to do anything wrong and to do what you're supposed to do, to be where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala expects you to be, and to not be where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala expects you not to be, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sees you. But if that's not enough for you, like you just can't bring yourself for that presence to come to you, then know that the angels are there and they see everything. And they write everything. As Surah Al-Kahf says, the day when they'll look at their books, they say, what is this book? Nothing small and nothing large escapes it. He says, okay, what if that's not present enough for you? And he said, well, think about the fact that when you do a good deed, you'll get reward for it. And if you do a bad deed, you'll be punished. You'll be held culpable for it. And he says, well, what if that's not enough for you? He said, well, then at least remember the fact that what if somebody of respect was in front of you, right? Like, what are your imam or your mother or your father or your grandfather? And he says, if that causes you to self-correct, then you should be ashamed of yourself. That you're self-correcting because of a person and you're not self-correcting because of Allah. And he said, but if that's not enough for you, he said, there's nothing I can say to you. Right? And that reflects back to the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ that if you don't have any shyness, then do what you please. And one of the dangers of our period is it's so easy to break the boundaries of shyness. Structurally. I mean, people have always had the ability to do that. But structurally, it's become easier. By Twitter, by Facebook, by these things, it's become structurally easier. And then societally, it's become easier because people keep pushing the boundaries more and more and more and more. So it's going to occur. Just because something's societally imposed, that doesn't mean it's wrong. Right? There's a lot of societal impositions. That doesn't mean it's wrong. Right? And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also says in the Quran, وَأَقِمَ الصَّلَاةَ طَرَفَيِ النَّهَارِ وَزُلُوفًا مِنَ اللَّيْلِ إِنَّ الْحَسَنَاتِ يُذْهِبْنَ السَّيِّئَاتِ ذَلِكَ ذِكْرَى لِلذَّاكِرِينَ. Prophet, keep up the prayer at both ends of the day and during parts of the night, for good things drive bad away. This is a reminder for those who are aware. Good things drive away the bad. Right? So if you fill your time with good, it's going to be very difficult for you to do bad. But if you leave it open and neutral, there's no neutrality. Something will fill it. Right? And there are certain times that are more holy than others, like the morning time, after Fajr, right before Fajr, right after Asr, before Maghrib, right after Maghrib, between Maghrib and Isha. And there are certain times that are just kind of known for negativity, like late at night. I know some shuyukh don't allow their students to go out at night. Alhamdulillah, we're not in a situation where we're prohibited from going out at night, but night times, there's a lot of bad stuff that happens at nighttime. People act differently. We're on college campuses, a few of us, so people act totally differently in the nighttime than they do at the day. The same person looks like 180 degrees the other way. Royster Harper, who's the vice president of student affairs at the university, told me she's friends like online with students. She sees them in the daytime and she says, who are you after you leave this office? You're a totally different person. She said, at least don't put me in the status updates so that I don't see it, If you want me to write you a recommendation letter, right? So being careful of certain times. Don't put yourself in bad situations. We shouldn't put ourselves in those situations. So all of that's really important. And, Sayyidina Umar, it's well known that if anything negative were to occur, he would always do something good until Satan himself didn't want to come near him, because anytime he tried to trick him to do something bad, he just ended up doing more good than intended. He said, I'm just going to leave him. Right? And so we should be like that. We should be like that. Ask for forgiveness, right? And generally they say the integrals of repentance are 4. 1, that you stop doing the sin. So if you're, God forbid, doing something, you just stop it, right? 2, that you can't repent, in other words, while you're doing it. 2, that you feel bad about it. There's remorse. 3, that you intend to never return to it again. And you have to highlight and italicize and bold intend, not actually never return to it again. That's something different. And then the last, if it has to do with other creation, that you right the wrong. If it has to do with Allah, you don't right the wrong. But when it goes to creation, you right the wrong. Like what? Like if you stole from somebody, you figure out a way to give them back the money. And then do good deeds. And stuff snowballs. And the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ is meant to protect you. So if you see yourself doing the obligations and the recommended acts, it's a lot less likely that you'll fall into the prohibited, or that you'll stop doing the obligation. But if you see yourself doing very little sunnah, eventually you'll fall into not doing any obligation. If you see yourself staying away from the dislike, the makruhat, and the forbidden, it's a lot less likely that you'll fall into the forbidden. But if you start pushing up against the disliked, eventually you'll fall into the forbidden. The second something bad happens, just ask for forgiveness and then do something good. Yes.
What about things that are neutral? You know,
Yeah.
they're
Sure.
neither good nor bad.
Sure.
I mean,
Yeah. I think in general, we try not to be really tough on people, but our teachers, what I've learned from Sheikh Abdul Karim and others, is you try to minimize that the permissible be used for other than for Allah. So the intent, you just ascribe the intent for good. So then you kind of remove the neutral category because all of the neutral becomes a form of worship, or at least a form of good deed, right? So when you eat, it's neutral, right, other than what keeps you alive. So you eat and you just intend that you're, benefiting from God's, bounty, you're strengthening yourself for worship, you're all this stuff. Khalas, everything you did just became an act of good deed. Because the thing is always, the more that you're pushing one direction, you're moving away from another direction. So you want to constantly be like in a state of awareness. And any of us who have been like aware of our own actions will know that this is true. It doesn't even need to really be taught. If there's any type of self-awareness, you'll see how you fall one way or you fall the other way. And never despair. Never. Despair is the opposite, right? Is the opposite of what we want to teach ourselves. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's mercy is enormous, right? His mercy is enormous. You should have a good opinion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He can forgive anything. Okay, we only have a couple more minutes, so let me round out the last part of the hadith, because I'll repeat the hadith. The hadith says, Prophet, keep up the... that's not the hadith. The hadith says, the messenger of God, Allah bless him and give him peace, said, keep God in mind wherever you may be, follow a sin with a virtuous act, thus erasing it, and be beautiful in your character with people. So the last section is be beautiful in your character with people. And I think, was it Imam Abdullahi last night who said this? It was either Sheikh Abdul Karim or Imam Abdullahi. Might have actually even been Hamad Ishtiyaq. That just like Allah created for you your outward form, your khalq, with a sukoon on the middle letter, He also created for you your khuluq. And they say that's like your inward form, right? Your character. And just like you want to beautify your outward form, you want to beautify your inward form with good character and removing from it vices. And this is a responsibility that you have and a right of other creation that you treat them well. Right? And this is, say every time I think about it, it's just sad. And people are like, this is who I am. Love it or leave it. You don't like it, don't hang out with me. But it's so bizarre. Like a lot of those people, not all of them, a lot of those same people, they go out of their way to make sure they look a certain way that conforms to society. But then they're not willing to put in that type of effort on their character. It doesn't really make any sense. How come the physical form conforms, but then the personality and the character doesn't conform? Right? And so we should be people who, in both realms, we're aware. Physically, there should be some form of conformity in some form, a light form, right? You don't go out wearing whatever you want and totally without hygiene, right? Because there's a sunnah to beautify oneself. And then similarly, in times of your character, you're doing it for Allah. You're not doing it for other people, but the conformity is good because it reminds you, and there's boundaries, right? So one of our teachers asked one of their shuyukh, they said, I dress beautifully because I have the intention of wanting to attract people to Islam. And they said to them, that's good, but a better intention was like, Allah is beautiful and He loves beauty. You're dressing beautifully for Allah. Right? So similarly, your good character, yeah, one good thing is you're trying to bring people to the religion, but more importantly is because Allah either obligated or encouraged you to have those traits. And those are traits of the Prophet ﷺ. And, as Sheikh Abdul Karim mentioned the last couple of days after this whole incident that's occurred in Paris and elsewhere, that's what our shuyukh teach us. The answer to all of this is just following through and in acquiring the qualities and the characteristics of the Prophet ﷺ. That is the answer, right? There is a place for care. There's a place for all these other institutions to respond. But for us as average people, Like what we need to do is be beautiful in how we treat one another and take on the qualities of the Prophet ﷺ. And when there's a critical mass, things will change, right? But we can't be rushed to kind of some type of strategy online and in the news, and then we're still mistreating one another. We want to protect the Prophet ﷺ, his reputation, but then we're constantly manifesting the opposite of that, right? Alhamdulillah. Any questions? Alayhi salatu wassalam. Yeah.
When you mentioned the number 60,000,
Yeah.
what was that the number of?
So I've heard Sheikh Ali and others say that that is the number of hadith that are not repeated. Because the thing is, there are multiple, it's complicated to explain all of it, but there are multiple copies, if you want to call them that, of the same hadith. So you're going to get a lot more. There's hundreds of thousands if you count the copies, right? But in terms of hadith, singular hadith, he says that they're around 60,000. But that's not like a consensus. There's a lot of differences of opinion about it. And think about how amazing that is. And also think about how ridiculous it is that somebody tells you there's a hadith that says this. Because if there are 60,000 hadith, there's a lot of hadith that say a lot of things. How do I know that that hadith isn't nuanced in some other hadith? So I think I shared this story with you. It might have been Sheikh Abdul Karim shared it. It's a well-known story that is told. One of the ashab of Abu Hanifa came to Medina, and he was praying, and he gave salams, 2 salams. And so one of the people of Medina, they're known that they would only give 1 salam. So he said, where did you learn that salam? He said, I learned it from a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. He said, but I don't know a hadith like that. He said, do you know all of the hadith? He said, no. He said, do you know half of the hadith? He said, no. He said, do you know a third of them? He said, yeah, I think I know about a third of them. He said, just put it in the group that you don't know. And he just got up and he said he laughed. Right? Because it's a good response, right? And I often, when people kind of push me like that, that's generally what I don't, not in that kind of aggressive of a way. I said, but there's a hadith that you don't know. Right? And generally the person is going to know very little. Generally, the people who do that, generally. Right? So, we leave it to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to care for this ummah, to change some of these diseases that we have widespread. Any questions? Yeah, Nuh, and then Mahasan.
I've often heard the term silsila, for along with hadith, referring to chain. What does that term mean?
It means chain, but I don't know if they use that in hadith science.
My question was just the number that you said were actually in the Sahih Bukhari, correct?
The actual number? Yeah, 7,275. I always want to say 25. And those are not, those are with repetitions. So there are repetitions in the book. And remember, they used to sit and memorize all of these, right? This wasn't, the writing was secondary. They would memorize these chains. And so, a hafil, one of the definitions of a hafil, now we use it for somebody who hafiled the Quran, which is a great feat. It's an enormous act of worship. But back then, it was of course you memorize the Quran. So a hafid would be you memorize 100,000 hadith. Right? That doesn't mean that we should not call these people hafad. We should. Anybody who memorizes the Quran should have respect. There should be a level of respect for people who carry the book of Allah. Right? But the point is, there was a higher standard back then than there is now. Yeah. Any other questions? Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen wa sallallahu wa sallam ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi sallam ajma'in. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He accepts from us, that He fills our hearts with light, with love, that He makes us beloved to Him and to His Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to come to the aid of those who need Him. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He gaze upon this gathering, a gaze after which we will need nobody and nothing. We ask that He have us benefit from these last few days of the month of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have you and I benefit from it, a benefit after which we will need nobody and nothing. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for all of the good of this world and the next. We ask Him of what the Prophet ﷺ asked Him of. We seek His protection from what the Prophet ﷺ sought His protection from. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi sallam ajma'in. Al-Fatiha.